Hello, I'm Wayne Hobson, one of the pastors here at Good Shepherd Church, and I'm so delighted you could be with us again for Grab, Gather, and Go. As you develop in your living relationship with Jesus Christ, the chance to grab some materials, to gather with friends, family, and neighbors, and then to go forth with a greater understanding of how our living relationships develop on a daily basis. And today's message came from John chapter 9. The entire chapter, ironically, because there's a miracle there that takes place in the midst of the Jesus Effect series that we're doing that is so fascinating. I wanted to take a little time with you to discuss it. So if you have your Bibles, turn to John chapter 9 with me, and I want to just kind of review a couple of highlights from this series of events related to one miracle. That's right. Only one miracle takes place in this entire chapter, which makes it so unique to many other scriptures that we find in the Gospels, and so unique to many of the stories about healings and miracles, because John is making a specific point about Jesus in this story of this man who was born blind. And so the Jesus effect of this is how this blind man, has an interaction with Jesus that affects him in both a positive way and a negative way. Let's dig right into it. From verse 1 of chapter 9, we are captured right away because we're told that as Jesus was passing by, he saw a blind man born that way from birth. What's so interesting here is the phrase, and as he, Jesus, was passing by, because it correlates actually to the last verses of chapter 8 of John's Gospel, which I'll quickly review for you. Jesus has just been confronted by the religious leaders, and more than likely he was in Jerusalem. That's where the setting of chapter 8 kind of takes place at the very beginning of that chapter. And we're not told whether or not anything changes in where he is. What we are told is that the dynamics of the conversations he has does change. Because in the midst of that, he declares in chapter 8 that before Abraham was, I am. What's so unusual here is that not only is it that Jesus is a man who's in his early 30s when he says this, but the Sanhedrin, the leaders, when they hear him say, before Abraham was, I am, they got so caught up in the midst of that they ask him, how can you say that you were during the time of Abraham when you're not even 50 years old yet? And when Jesus' response to that question, which was, before Abraham was, I am, that phrase, I am, makes the leaders so irate, they attempt to stone Jesus. Why? Because that phrase, I am, correlates to what God said to Moses. When Moses asked God, what name shall I tell the people is of this God who sent me? And God said, I am that I am. So therefore, the words I am automatically signify with God and his specific name. So the Sanhedrin thought that Jesus was saying, I am God. And he was. That's the point which they tried to stone him, and he disappears out of their midst. Somehow, we're not sure what happens, but they are unable to find him to stone him, and he passes by them. Enter verse 1 of chapter 9. And as he was passing by, he sees the blind man. That is so noteworthy because John's whole point at the rest of the chapter of 9 focuses on this blind man and what happens to him as he begins to truly see who Jesus is. So here's what I wanted you to think about as you gather with your group and discuss these particular verses from John chapter 9, verses 1 all the way to 41. You won't have time to read the entire chapter, but I want you to take a look at verses 2 and 3 because there's questions asked. Jesus' disciples, when they look upon the blind man, they say, well, who sinned? Because this man was born blind, so obviously somebody sinned. Was it him or was it his parents? And Jesus' response in verse 3 is that no one sinned. This happened to glorify God. But then in verses 35 and 36, something wonderful happens when Jesus, after he has healed this blind man, you'll realize that this blind man doesn't know who Jesus is yet. He just knows that Jesus heals him. And because Jesus healed him, and this man who was healed happened to have been healed on, of all days, the Sabbath, the man ends up getting excommunicated by the religious leaders. Yes, the same ones who wanted to stone Jesus. And that's why throughout the chapter, you hear these men, these religious leaders, trying to hunt down Jesus to figure out where he is to complete what they never got to finish. That is to kill Jesus himself. In the midst of this blind man's caught in the middle. He gains his sight because Jesus miraculously heals his eyes, but at the same time, the result is he gets excommunicated for being the recipient of the Jesus effect. The glorious part of this story takes place in verses 35 and 36 when the man asks Jesus, who is the one that you say is the Son of God? Because Jesus asked him, do you believe? Do you believe in the Messiah? And the man says, where is he? And Jesus' response in verse 36, the most powerful words we can think of is that between verses 36 and 37, Jesus reveals, I am he that speaks to you. And the man's response is, Lord, I believe. And he worships Jesus. That's the ultimate end of the Jesus effect, that in our blindness, spiritually, we don't see Christ. But when he reveals himself to us, ultimately, we see him, we adore him, we worship him, we follow him. As you continue in your lesson in your studies, I wish you Godspeed, and I pray that as you continue and gather and grow, that your faith grows abundantly. God bless.